In her role, she leads the World Bank's support to Ministry of Finance, Government of India, on social protection measures following COVID-19. She also leads a series of World Bank engagements to strengthen the capability of state governments to accelerate direct benefit transfers and improve delivery of core social protection benefits. Prior to joining the World Bank in 2014, she has worked with ILO, SEWA, and Center for Policy Research on a range of issues in the areas of state capability, social protection, and informality. She recently led the World Bank's analysis of social protection in India with various academics and development practitioners, featured as the Schemes to Systems series in the Indian Express in 2018. She has trained in development economics at Delhi University and has completed her post-graduation in public administration and economics from Harvard University. She is also the author of the popular book, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence. In the book, she draws on more than a decade of personal stories and statistics to describe how a diverse group of working women have experienced, how a diverse group of women have, have experienced the period between liberalization and lockdown in India. Fandom for Shah Rukh, his pervasive and powerful icon, allowed for many difficult conversations on men, money, and misogyny to emerge. And Shaina will be sharing those insights with us today. And as I was just saying 2 minutes ago, being a fellow economist and more importantly, SRK fan, I personally loved your book, Shaina. I admired your writing. And I would like to read 2 lines from your book, which I think very aptly summarizes it. So it's from the chapter, Who is Shah Rukh Khan? So the lines are, being Shah Rukh means being an important icon for women across vast regions, religions, and classes. Someone who unites many women in admiration, anger, and anger's parent expectations. So it's an honor to have you here, Shaina, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Momita. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. In conversation with Shaina is Professor Tejaswini Niranjana. She's the director of the Center for Inter-Asian Research and the Dean of Online Programs in Ahmedabad University. Before coming to Ahmedabad University, she was professor and head Department of Cultural Studies, Lignan University, Hong Kong, and director Center for Cultural Research and Development. She's co-founder of the Center for the Study of Culture and Society, Bangalore, which offered an innovative interdisciplinary PhD program from 2000 to 2012. During 2012 to 2016, she headed the Center for Indian Languages in Higher Education at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and was an Indian language advisor to Wikipedia. Professor Niranjana is the author of Citing Translation, History, Post-Structuralism, and the Colonial Context, Mobilizing India, Women, Music, and Migration Between India and Trinidad, and Musicophilia in Mumbai, Performing Subjects and the Metropolitan Unconscious. Her most recent edited volumes include Genealogies of the Asian Present, Situating Inter-Asia Cultural Studies with Wang Jiaoming, and Music, Modernity, and Publicness in India. For her translations from Kannada into English, she has won the Central Sahitya Academy Award, the Karnataka State Sahitya Academic Award, and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. She won the 2021 National Translation Award for Prose for her English translation of the book No Presents Please, Mumbai Stories, an anthology of short stories in Kannada and authored by Jayant Kaikini. The award was given by the American Literary Translators Association. She's curator of the Sat Sat Project, a musical collaboration between Indian and Chinese performers, and also a producer of 3 documentary films based on her music research. So welcome Tejaswini also. Before I just hand it over to Tejaswini, I would just like to highlight the rules. Everyone will be muted for the duration of the conversation, except of course our 2 speakers. We will request you to put your questions and comments in the chat box. We'll take up these questions, curate them, and at the end of the conversation around 5 p.m., we will request our speakers to address them. And lastly, I would request everyone to rename your Zoom ID to your real name so that we can see the name and so we know who's asking these questions. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. That is all from my side. And now I hand it over to Tejaswini.
Thank you, Momita. It's really a pleasure, and I'm glad you asked me to be the person moderating this conversation or engaging with Shaina over this set of questions that she's raised in her most recent book. I just want to say something before that. It's just that my colleagues at the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University have invited Shaina to be with us in person on April 27th And this she's going to be giving a talk 5 to 6:30 p.m. on that day, and as an inducement, wrong word. As an additional bonus, we have a high tea for the faculty where they will interact with Shrayana. They need no inducement. I was asked whether Shah Rukh Khan would be present. And I think that actually leads me to make this remark that this book is not really about Shah Rukh Khan. I would like to begin by stating that, because although he is like such a central part of the imagination of those people that you talk to, the book is mostly about the persons that you talk to, the women who are fans of Shah Rukh. And when you look at real women who are have these fantasies about someone from the movies, which is a rather common phenomenon, especially in India, but also in other parts of the world. You do ask, like, is it just a general phenomenon and which can't be explained except for saying that popular culture is so powerful and women like to engage with it like anyone else, or is there something special that one is trying to understand here? Why Shah Rukh Khan? Not the Shah Rukh Khan, the person, Shah Rukh Khan, the persona, the person in the film, etc. And I think that it could be easy to say that women in India are suffering under many, dimensions of what you might want to call patriarchy, in using a very grand concept. But I don't think that really gets to the bottom of the phenomenon that you're talking about. And for me, what was fascinating about your book, which I really admire, is the level of detail and the level of your understanding of and analysis of the multidimensional ways in which women relate to the worlds around them and to the world of public culture. So having said that, I'd like to throw the first question at you, if I may. There's going to be lots of questions. I'm going to try and wrap up in time for audience interaction as well. So I want to begin by saying that fact and fiction come together in your book, whether you're talking about the films of SRK or about his fans. So how do you use this kind of blurring between fact and fiction to effect in your book? For example, through the composite characters that you create. Was that a deliberate strategy? Could you talk a little bit about composite characters? And what were the challenges in that chapter when you create a fan character based on 80 interviews of 80 fans of the Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge generation? Big question, but I think it's a good beginning for us.
No, it's a great beginning, Tejaswini, and I will try and withhold my desire to keep calling you Professor Niranjana, but we discussed the rules. And I just want to really say, I admire your work so much. And for me to be in conversation with you, this is just, it's a thrill for me. So thank you so much for being here. Honestly, Tejaswini, I have to say the composites came out of necessity. I wish I could say I had some grand, literary design, but what happened was the book is, as you know, Tejaswini, has characters from different class backgrounds. The women who show up in what we would call the working class precariat, I met these women through research projects that I was usually a research assistant for. These are the women towards the latter part of the book. And all these projects, Tejaswini, I'm quite transparent about it in the acknowledgement section where I talk about the research methods used. Those women, there were research subject clearances, right? That these projects, as you know, any project that involves collecting qualitative data or any kind of data typically goes through an ethics research review board. And so I had to follow norms, and there were very clear norms there. So in fact, writing their stories, strangely, was easier because there were very clear norms about what I could do, could not do. And I also kept going back to them to share for permission and so on. And there was also a finite set of these women because it's difficult to constantly be in touch with people who barely have time to talk to me or have mobile phones. But when it came to elite women, which is where actually the composites come in. There are two big composites in the piece, in the book. One is actually the first chapter, which is actually a composite of 5 women. I originally had wanted to write it up as 5 women in one chapter, but then 3 of them said no. And I had to, obviously, you have to then just adhere to these norms. And when the 3 of them said no, then I thought, well, what's the best way to write this? And I wanted actually to start the book with this feeling of romantic dissatisfaction, this churn, which you're right, which is sort of very multifaceted, which is partly economic, partly sociological, all the things that we lump into patriarchy, but it's much more complicated than that. And I realized the only way these women were comfortable with me writing it was if I actually mixed a bunch of these elements together and I wrote the composite. So that was actually the first composite that was written, completely by necessity, because many of the women there said that we don't want it to be so clearly identified, right? The second composite, which is what you're talking about, is the 80 women who I follow, again, from our class background. And actually, the chapter is called an elite composite. They're, in fact, right up in the beginning, because these were women I really didn't follow as, I think, as rigorously as I followed the other women in the book about whom I write specific stories, whose life histories I've tried to capture. These were women I often surveyed, Tejaswini, specifically to understand their fandom. And what I actually did, in qualitative methods, often you can create a median character. In marketing research, they do this as well. You take what's the median sets of attributes. So for example, for most of the women I was talking to, they tended to study commerce or economics. Most of the women I spoke to tended to have watched Shah Rukh in a small town as opposed to the big city for the first time. The most women I spoke to tended to go to a satellite TV wala, someone, a cable bhaiya as they call it, and push and nudge for Shah Rukh films to be shown. And so what I decided to do was, this is almost a statistical construct, but you use it in qualitative methods as well. You create this median character based on the most common attributes that were constantly emerging across these 80 interviews, and I wrote it up. I did that, one, to just make my life easier as well, because seeking 80 permissions, and also to write it as 80 individual pieces would just be impossible. It would make the reader, it would be frustrating to write and frustrating to read, I imagine. And so I use the composite in that case actually more as a statistical tool, because I wanted to tell the story of all the attributes. And I think one thing I will, say about that is that what really surprised me is how much we have in common, as opposed to how much we have in difference. Because I realize across these 80 women, the common attributes, typically they'd usually watch the same Shah Rukh film around the same time. And as you said, they are the DDLJ generation. The advent of technologies, the advent of the economy, all these things, they face them together. These were women often born in the 1980s. And I think then writing it as a composite was most helpful, but I would be lying if I said it was a literary device. It was very much born out of ethical norms and considerations around who I was writing about. And yet these women wanted to participate, but they wanted to participate with certain protections. And I felt that the composite was the right way to do that, because for a lot of the other women, there were very strict norms that I was following with ERBs, etc. And with professors through whom I met some of the women for projects. But for women who were not part of those traditional research projects, I needed to form some of my own rules. And I think the best way to do it was, if someone didn't give me permission, I wrote it as a composite and made sure they felt comfortable.
I think that's a very frank and also interesting answer. And I think that maybe the students in the audience will get a sense of how to even use this kind of strategy, whatever you like to call it. So let's move on to the next question I have for you. So apart from all the adjectives that your book must have collected by now, has anyone called it a brave book? Because I want to point to this fact that you actually turn the camera on yourself and lay bare in great detail your romantic choices and your heartbreaks. And again, let me suggest that this is a writing strategy. But why would you talk about why you chose this strategy? Did you ever share your personal problems with your interviewees as a way of building bridges? Many of us who do ethnographic research tend to find a way of connecting to people, especially across class and caste, etc. So this is the question.
Yes. So I think the first bridge that we had was Shah Rukh. But the thing is, and I write about this again quite transparently in the book, anywhere I would go, all these women, irrespective of class, caste, it didn't matter, Tejaswini, everyone wanted to know whether I was married. Even now, I mean, as an aside, I should tell you that many of the women, they're following two things when it comes to the life of the book. One is, when will Mr. Khan show up? And then I think all requests for anonymity, I'm convinced, will just fall by the wayside. I'm quite convinced of it. And the other is also, did you find a husband through the book? That's sort of and I think this obsession, I think, especially in sort of, women's lives to talk about, well, how's your personal life and how's that going? And I think honestly that, so yes, my personal life did come up. But honestly, the reason I decided to write, and you're right, this was actually a strategy. Unlike the composite, where I had to come up with a strategy to deal with a crisis in a way, this was a strategy because one of the things, I wrote the book in response to a very technocratic way we discuss gender issues. And in my formal day job, I write the language of a technocrat, where there's always this tremendous distance between the statistics and what is being observed and the person who's writing them. And in fact, the more the distance, the more rigorous and respectable the work is supposed to be. And certainly, I think, a certain kind of economics, that's really considered the case. I was tired of those rules. I did not, and I felt that those rules just did not do justice to the stories and the texture of the lives that I had been privileged to learn about, to hear from. And I felt the only way to flatten this out in a way across women, across class, was also to be very honest about my own fandom, as opposed to being an outsider observing from a distance. Because Tejaswini, as you know, anyone doing qualitative research in our country, or any research in our country, knows there's such tremendous social distance between us and often the people we're writing about. I think sometime in 2013, I decided, well, I wanted to include women from my own class group as well. That was one way to try and minimize that distance. And the other way I felt I could minimize it, it's never going to go away, but at least for me to feel that I'd put in a sincere effort, was to be honest about my fandom and write about myself the way I was actually writing about some of the other people involved, right? And they knew that, which I think really did help. And the second reason I did it is that at the time when I was getting really irritated with all this technocratic, sort of the traditional way we're supposed to write about gender in a certain field, I was reading all these writers. I rediscovered Kamala Das, for instance, at that time. I was reading Vivian Gornick, who I think these two women really have shaped, I think, the way I think about form and writing. And they were all very honest about their own personal experiences as they entered into the world. And I felt that that writing really comforted me when I was dealing with something in my own life. And I felt that I wanted to maybe offer that function to someone else who would read this book. And I felt the only way to do it would be to be somewhat honest. Keeping protections, again, there, all the ex I write about knew that I was writing about him, and he read it, and that's a whole separate, I think, conversation. When I meet you in Ahmedabad, we can discuss. But I'm actually very grateful to him, because as a consequence, I was able to write about it. But to me, that was a strategy to reduce the distance, and it felt more of a feminist text to me than a technical text. I mean, there can be technical feminist texts, but I really wanted that distance to collapse a bit, and to be more present as a narrator and more honest, as opposed to being at a distance observing and, because I'm not far away. There's a reason why these women are telling me these stories. It's because there was an exchange, and I wanted the reader to enter into that exchange.
So one of the things I really like about your book is its dedication to locating feelings and persons in historical time. For example, in your chapter 5, you talk about women of your class being the last generation of Indians to go through their teenage years without apps, the internet, or a smartphone, and depending, as you said, on the colony's cable bhaiya for access to Shah Rukh Khan films.
Yeah.
How did this affect your fandom, and has your expression of fandom changed in the age of digital intimacy? So both yours as well as the women of your class that you talk about.
Yeah, so Tejaswini, this year I just have to confess that I quite hate the digital world. I just have to be very honest. There's a reason why we are doing this right now online, but I'm really glad that there's an offline. And in fact, off late, anybody asks me, I'm just saying I'm moving away from Zoom as much as possible. But having said that, I think that with the digital advent and the way it is, the images of Mr. Khan have just proliferated. It's far easier to access, and it's also far easier to access in a very minute way. So for example, you see this coming up in the book, which is towards the latter part of the 2000s. There are fans who say, for example, there's a Rajput woman who, Kal Ho Na Ho, the film came out around the time her marriage was arranged, and she was very upset about this marriage. She didn't want to be married. She wanted to study, but she had to be married. And she says, each time I watch that scene when he dies, it reminds me of like the sadness of that arranged marriage. And I know sometimes when she wants a really good cry, she will watch specific scenes, she'll move forward, right, to find those scenes or a specific song. So I think the atomization of what is available, right, the contentification of culture makes it easier for us to consume. I think what is done to the fandom actually finally is the reverse. I hate having to constantly declare fandom. And there's one thing, something about digital technology, that you're constantly declaring the self, right? You're declaring interest. There's something about the way it works that even for connection, you need this constant declaration. And I say that as someone who's written a book about being a fan of Shah Rukh Khan. And yet I feel that one of the things I'm trying to really do is I want my fandom to be somewhat my own. I mean, I think I've shared as much of it as I could, in fact, more than most, but I don't want to be declaring it. And I think the third thing that the digital piece has done is that for a lot of women, particularly from the precariat, so you talked about my class, and I think I don't think the fandom necessarily changes, but I think the access and the costs of access and the atomization of some kinds of content. So this thing that you'll keep hearing women from my class in the book say, I like this bit about Shah Rukh and I don't like that bit about Shah Rukh, right? Like this picking and choosing. I think digital technologies make it easier. So you can be a fan of a specific genre, almost, of this self-created version of Shah Rukh, right? As opposed to this wholesale version. But if you look at women from the precarious economic communities in the book, there I actually think that that's where digital is having such a huge impact, because suddenly these young women are seeing images of femininity and even masculinity like the way they'd never seen before, and even bits of Shah Rukh's icon. Because remember, for most of these women, they come from too economically a difficult environment to be able to watch a long movie by themselves, at their own leisure. They don't have the leisure time, they don't have the income. So for them, if their brother has a smartphone or their mother has a phone and they can see some images, suddenly they're accessing more of Shah Rukh. So I think for them, it's actually huge because you access him much, much more. So for example, during the pandemic, you would have seen one of the women in my book whose mother is a unionizer from Ahmedabad, actually moves to Bombay. She says, oh, I've been following Shah Rukh's videos during the pandemic. That wouldn't have happened. And it gave her a lot of joy. And she's stuck to those videos. I know how many times she's rewatched that. It's a song he does to tell everyone that everything will be all right. I write about it right at the end, when if nobody else is telling you everything will be all right, but at least Shah Rukh is telling you everything will be all right. And that means so much to her. That wouldn't have happened, Tejaswini, had it not been for these sort of digital connections that exist. So I think it's more a question of access and cost to access. I think that has changed. I don't think the tone and tenor of the fandom, I certainly didn't pick up a shift. What I do see is this excessive declaration and almost this memification, which I'm not a big fan of, but I know it really works for some people.
The fan club. We've already talked about the fandom. So the fan club, broadly speaking, its members are differentiated by class, caste, religion, language. Say a little more about what they have in common. As you point out, the fan club includes elite working women, middle class women like the accountant or the flight attendant that you talk about, homemaker fan women, many of whom have chosen to leave the world of paid employment, domestic helpers, peace workers in the informal economy. So what brings them together? Are they in the fan club for the same reasons? As you say, is it that the fans represent a sisterhood of desperate and disappointed women, or is that a dramatic statement? Too dramatic a statement.
It's a dramatic statement, but it is true. I think lots of dramatic statements about the state of women in our country are accurate. I think we do need drama in the way we deal with gender, to be honest. Nothing else will suffice. Having said that, I think what unites all these women, Tejaswini, is three things. One, to be very matter of fact, is that they agreed to participate in this mad chronicle that I decided to venture on. They were tolerant of my questions and they participated. The second is that they are big fans, not just of Mr. Khan, but of wanting to stand on their own 2 feet and to declare that they want to be independent. And I think actually in our country, it's still quite difficult for many women to openly declare that and to own it and then to act up on these kinds of desires, right? To claim them and then forcefully pursue them in a way. I think that's the second thing that's in common with them. And the third, I think they do see in Mr. Khan, I think this goes back to what we were earlier saying about the creation of Mr. Khan. I don't think, usually when we think about celebrities, there's this idea that there's this one version of Shah Rukh that he himself, along with the film industry, has created, and that everyone is a wholesale consumer of just that one image. When you see the book, you realize these are all women who are co-creators of his image. And they have co-created them based on their own realities, their own hopes, their own frustrations, the very aggressive masculine landscapes that they occupy. Um, and then that creation of Shah Rukh is very different. So, for example, in the elite upper class women, often women who are children of the salaried classes, not the propertied classes, I noticed there was this big difference. I found very few women. In fact, what's interesting to me is, and I don't claim this to be statistically representative at all, but what was interesting to me is so many of the women who told me that they absolutely love Shah Rukh, often they came from families that didn't necessarily have property wealth, which, by the way, marks there's a big connection there with him as well, because one of the first things he did was he wants to buy a home for himself. And so I think for a lot of those women, he is mobility, he is consolidating your privilege through asset wealth, he is triumphing over network effects. Many of these women complained about how they didn't have fathers who had Gymkhana club memberships, for example. And Shah Rukh comes from, not from the same film industry fraternity. So there are all these ideas about network wealth. When you move to the sort of emerging middle class in the book, Tejaswini, these are the first women in their family, Gold and the accountant I'm thinking of, who have studied, completed their education, wanted to work outside the home. And I think to them, he is almost self-help guru and coach. He is like a life coach. If you see the way in the book I describe, they're obsessively making notes of the things he's saying, the lectures he gives about careers, about professionalism. To them, he is not just someone who's cute and a fun, sexy superstar, but to them, he is someone who is telling them how to deal with heartbreak. I mean, Gold, I spent almost a significant number of pages in that chapter telling you how she turns to his icon when she's facing a very brutal sense of rejection in her personal life. And, it's not just comfort that he's providing, but he's almost providing her, advice and things that she will repeat to others. So it's very different. They've created a very different, almost like a management guru, self-help guru version of Shah Rukh, right? And the third, I think, when you start moving to the more, the precariat, the working classes, as we would call them, there, I think things really change. There, he is a different kind of man. He is a more progressive, vulnerable man. He is seen as a man that not only do some of these women want to marry, others want to be him. He announces sexual opportunity. Suddenly you realize there are men like these in cities. You've never seen so many images proliferating like his before, especially around liberalization. So I think they've all co-created these different versions. But the one thing that is common across all classes, Tejaswini, and I think this goes back to, in fact, a poll question that we started with in the beginning, is that I think he is seen as a man who actually engages with the needs, feelings, expectations of women. And, in the book, I measure how much women speak in his films, and his characters tend to be always be doing what we call emotional labor in the books, right, in the films. And you'll constantly hear this from women in different ways. They'll say, oh, have you seen that he appreciates the tiffin that his wife makes? Or have you noticed that he cries in front of women? Or have you noticed that he will lose his job or his life, for example, in the films because of a woman's politics or a woman's needs? I'm thinking of, say, a film like Dil Se, for instance. And I think one thing that was common cross-class, while I do think each of the women, to be honest, looks at him very differently, what was common was this emotionally engaged man who was willing to show up for women's needs, feelings, and expectations. And I think it is a sad comment on the reality of masculinity that these women occupy and their own families, because clearly in real life, they are not feeling as heard or as acknowledged. And they're looking to a movie star to start to mimic, what a more engaged masculinity or a more progressive female-friendly masculinity could look like.
Yeah, so I have a follow-up question here.
Yeah.
You're talking about how the fans follow SRK's pronouncements and interviews and take
Yeah.
notes and so on. But he's also known for his public interventions about secularism and
Yeah.
his Muslim identity.
Yes.
Does this feature at all in how all these very diverse fans respond to his persona?
That's a great question. No. In fact, one of the things that the things I realized, the only time his religion came up, Tirasuni, was when the NRC-CA protests were going on, very much towards the latter part of the research of the book. And there's a young Muslim woman in the book who I followed. And she says to me that she's really disappointed that he's not speaking up for their community, for his community. And then, of course, it takes her 2 minutes to add that, oh, but he must be doing something, but we just don't know because he has to be really quiet about it. And I think she has this beautiful line. She said, maybe it's a difficult time for a Muslim hero to speak. And in a way, I feel that she was almost predicting what would happen, nearly 7 to 8 months down the line with the scenes that we have, witnessed with his icon. That was the only time. All the women otherwise, he's really risen above any narrow religious idea. I did hear women say, we appreciate the way he talks about the country. He has progressive views about, the syncretic culture, our sort of, mixed ties, his marriage, for instance. But what was interesting to me is during the time that I spoke to these women, I think he was very much seen as a trope of a different kind of masculine than a progressive comment on religion. I mean, none of these women ever engaged with him from religion. My sense is, and you pick this up in the stories, particularly in the second part of the book, very conservative mercantile caste families where, for example, the accountant, whose father is extremely uncomfortable. And I actually write this, it's actually something he almost said that, to him, Shah Rukh was a pollutant in the house. He didn't like the fact that his daughter was obsessively looking up his images and had cutouts of his pictures. He was constantly surveilling what she was doing when it came to his iconography. I think part of it is obviously fears around her sexuality and wanting to control it. I wonder if part of it also was, he was a devout man. I wonder if part of it was a comment on his Muslim personhood, but no one ever in the realm of actual conversation ever brought that up. And he really seemed to have just risen above. Nobody reduced him to his religion or even to his identity. He was just sexy, he was successful, he was fun, he was kind. There were all these tropes that women used. Not his religion. The only time religion came up was right at the very end, especially as the country started to see the big shifts that we continue to see now.
Yeah. So I'm sure that when you come to Ahmedabad, we can talk more about does it appear only because people talk about it, or how else is it manifested? I think that's a different line of conversation altogether. But I'd like to now ask you about two concepts that you use and which I think very important in understanding Shah Rukh Khan's fandom. One is intimacy and the other one is modernity. I think they're related. So could you just say something about that?
Yeah. So Tejasvi, I think the first, I have to sort of say that to me, the way intimacy enters the book is that often when I would talk to women about Shah Rukh, and you're absolutely right, I think you said this in your opening remarks, and I've been repeating myself constantly saying this, book's not about him, but the conversations that he allowed me to have with these women that I interviewed. And one of the things, because of, he is South Asia's romantic superhero, immediately conversations around intimacy, but not just intimacy in the terms of lovers and boyfriends, but also intimacy when it comes to intimate relationships with parents, families, in-laws, all of that. And one of the things I actually learned, because as I studied the notes I'd made over a long period of time and these women's trajectories, is that intimacy is really the true home. I call it the true home of social change. And I think when all these women are pushing for a man like Shah Rukh, or they want to earn money to watch a Shah Rukh, or they're pushing for their own sexual or romantic autonomy, they are really rubbing up against some very conservative, difficult norms and constraints. And they're all deviating from a script of womanhood in a country that doesn't really want women to be out and about working and is very afraid of women having fun. I think all these women are deviating from those scripts. And when they deviate in their intimate lives, they are made to feel quite bad about themselves. There are questions about self-esteem, self-worth, as you see, that keep cropping up. Economists call these hidden taxes. But I think in fighting this fight in the intimate realm, none of these women, they may not be part of formal movements, or they're not, part of any kind of big protest in a very obvious way. But I've realized actually it's in the intimate realm where these constant interpersonal protests are happening iteratively. And I think that's a very important story. On modernity, I will say one thing. The person who I absolutely love, who's like my go-to sociologist, whose work is my go-to piece of work on modernity. I'd encourage everyone to read it. I'm sure your students have, is Dipankar Gupta's Mistaken Modernity. And one of the things he actually says right there is that the contemporary is not the modern. I mean, often, when people think, oh, these women wanting a star of our time means that this is modern. I don't actually think that they are modern in that way, because, we have stars of their own time, with every generation. I think what is modern to me when I listen to the stories that these women have said is one of the principal foundational ideas of modernity is that the public should guide or regulate private behaviors. So child abuse, violence, many of these sort of private practices, private behaviors, the public comes in, right, to step in. And I think there you realize when you see the book that for all our talk of how modern and how we've grown, I think it is this idea of mistaken modernity, because, just having biometrics does not make a country modern. It's how you use biometrics ethically and safely that actually tells you whether a country is modern, right? Using that principle. And if you look at the stories of the women in the book, each one of them is dealing with such harsh private behavior where the public is nowhere to be seen, Tejaswini. So for example, so many of the women in the book want to live on their own, but they can't because it's not safe. There are stories about this. Law and order is an issue. Women's security is an issue. And given that the public is not stepping in to deal with these private behaviors, I think the story of modernity is very important in the book, and actually how modernity India has modernized for its men. And I actually write this, it hasn't really modernized in that foundational sense for women. And the other, I think, area where I do think modernity creeps in when it comes to Mr. Khan is this idea that, what I think people would call intersubjectivity, right? Like the idea that even if you and I were all very different, there are things that are common amongst us. Like I can understand where you're coming from, your motivations. And one of the things I actually realized when all of us were talking about Mr. Khan, funnily enough, there was this strange kind of intersubjectivity when it came to each other, but also him. That, we sort of understood that, well, we sort of see this man similarly, and there's some common ground, right? That gets created in language, in the way women talk about him. So while there's obviously the modernity of, him and his outfits and, his big mansion and all of those things, which also are not particularly modern in all the films, right? Like with the ritual and all of that. I think what actually was interesting in terms of the conversation on modernity for me in the book was, one, these are all women looking to the state or to the market, particularly to the state, to step in where there are very harsh private behaviors against them. But the state is utterly failing and is utterly absent broadly. And the second is, I think, this idea of intersubjectivity, that, even if I'm not a Shah Rukh, but I can look at a Muslim man who's very different from me, and yet he and I have something in common. And you see this in the way the women talk about him, the way they talk about other people around them who like him as well, and the way they talk to me. And I think this creation of, that would be sort of the creation of almost some kind of a modern subjectivity, which I think all of these women seem to have.
Actually, when I asked, can you hear me?
Yeah.
When I asked you that question, I did not have in mind either intersubjectivity or the question of the public.
Yeah.
But really, and this will bring me to the next question, questions of social aspiration,
Yeah.
of selfhood and things like that. So I'd like to ask you now, let me quote something from your book. In India, our families and our popular culture prepare a woman to think of marriage as the most important thing she can do with herself, unquote. So do you think the family and popular culture are the key sites in India where social reproduction occurs? I was wondering, what about education? What about school? What about university? Does the messaging there run counter to family and popular culture, or is there a similarity? And could you say something about how families are represented in Shah Rukh Khan films? Of course, he doesn't have control over that necessarily. But how does this representation of families impact his fans?
So it's, and I think this is where I'll go back, Tejaswini, in fact, to this idea of what we were discussing, this intersubjectivity, for instance. So, for example, one of the things you realize that all these young women are doing is that they are seeing women in his films or seeing him and saying, well, there are parts of that I would like to recreate in my own life, right? And I think there's a kind of connection between someone who's very different from you and is almost creating these, I actually say that he's stirring women's imaginations. I actually think that is what the imagery is doing. But it's not just him. And I think this is why in the book, it's not just 400 odd pages of just women talking about him, because actually what helps the imagination then move from just utopic constructs to actually fighting very harsh fights in their real lives is their own families, their own educational institutions, their peer networks. I think those are places which are where a lot of this reproduction, as you call it, is so critical and is happening. Having said that, though, what I will say, and there are, and each one of them, as you can see, Tejaswini, in the book, the family as a construct, the friendship. I mean, so many of the women in the book say, I'm the first generation of women in my family to have a friend, because earlier the friends were always cousins or someone who was within the family, right? Like that's a big shift. That's a huge shift. And I think for a lot of the women in the book, they are picking up signs and cues and dealing with their negotiations, not just through popular culture and his image, but of course what they're seeing in the peer network, in their educational systems, what they've studied, what they've grown. Many of them read lots of literature. Some of them actually talk about the books they've read and how that means that their standards are as high as Shah Rukh. As an example, I'm quoting someone who actually says that to me. And so I think it's different for different women because the sort of social materials that they are accessing are very different. Having said that, though, I do think my sense is when I listen to the stories and I take a step back, I don't know how much our education system is doing for women, particularly who can't afford the best quality education. So for example, Vidya in my book, who is an IIT IIM grad, she really has access to the best education. And you can see actually going to IIT for her is not just about the engineering that she's learning. I actually say she learns social engineering. She discovers, how people live across the country because she's led a very privileged life. And suddenly when she goes to IIT, that opens up a bit. She's meeting people from very different milieu. And I think that's been really critical to her more than perhaps the pedagogy of it, but actually just educational spaces and what peer networks as well. However, if you move to, for example, say Manju in the book, who is a woman growing up in a village in Uttar Pradesh, making garments at home, she really wants to study. I mean, you can sense that, but she's not allowed to, and she's married off at a fairly young age. But even there, I mean, the sense I have is education for her was just going and seeing the privileges of other boys. So it did open up her horizons, but not because of the curriculum or not because of the way she was taught. She was taught in a very segregated way. And she actually says that the boys had better teachers and we just, the girls were barely taught. And so I don't know whether it's the education system that's formally doing it, but I think because of the space that it creates, it's allowing for these different imaginative possibilities, different peer networks to emerge, different notions of identity also to then just layer on each other. And I think that's a very important site. But the reason I wanted to zero in on Mr. Khan in particular is not to exaggerate the role that he's had. And that's not my intention. But to show you that, for all and we still do it. I think many of us are guilty of doing it, perhaps not you and me, but I think we're guilty of constantly dismissing mainstream Bollywood as sort of being, well, it's a somewhat regressive text. We don't want to engage with it particularly seriously. But I realized when I was listening to these women that actually there was something very serious going on in the way he was particularly portraying masculinity and pushing women to this stirring of the imagination around the masculine, right? That you could think about having a man like that, or you could be a man like that, for instance. Which kept coming up. And so I think to me, I zeroed in on him not only because I think of all our shared love for him, which I also think is a modern phenomenon in that sense of the word, the shared love for this kind of icon in an unambiguous way for someone we don't know. But also fundamentally because he has shaped, I think, our conversation around masculinity so deeply, particularly the women I was talking to, that not to give it that pride of place would then, I think, would be a disservice, I think, to what was actually going on and what I was seeing.
Yeah, I do get that. I think that you do make it quite clear that you're looking at how masculinity is represented,
Yes.
both in Shah Rukh Khan films and in his own offline persona, if you like, or off-screen persona. We see
Yeah.
it offline all the time.
But,
Sorry.
Tejaswini,
So
I
what
forgot.
I was asking,
Sorry, I
yeah,
forgot about the family question. I know
yes,
you are. That's a very
I was
important
trying
one,
to bring
Ashish.
you to
Yes,
that.
yes.
So,
Thank you,
what
thank
was
you.
the representation of families in the films?
Yeah, and so firstly, one thing I do have to say, it's, and again, I keep saying this, and I know it's annoying to repeat, but it's very different based on which woman I'm talking to. So, for example, for women who are watching him in, say, a village in Uttar Pradesh or organizing screens in a slum in Ahmedabad, for them, they think all of it is so fantastical anyway that the family construct and all of that is just, it's like just a good time. They are, and they're almost waiting, I think, for the songs and the love scenes to show up. And I watched some of these films with some of these women, and I can tell you, like, essentially, it's all just considered just a fantastical ruse, right? All of it, that families like this exist, that wealth like this exists, that a life like this exists. However, it is intergenerational, because those women who were watching the film and were the first generation, say, in this slum in Ahmedabad, as an example, it's an area in Bapu Nagar, who were watching him, their daughters grow up not believing so much the family construct and the way the family is defined. And the family in a lot of Shah Rukh's films in the early part is extremely ritual oriented, it's the dutiful woman, many of those tropes, right? I don't think any of them are engaging with it that way. In fact, they are engaging with it with the idea that a boy can love a girl and a girl can love a boy as well. And then they'll fight, be it family, they'll fly to London, to Delhi, to Punjab to try and woo each other, right? And there are these fantastical flights of the romantic imagination. I think that is really what I think he's, essentially giving voice to. And also, I think the other issue with the family in those films is that no one ever watched those films, and I followed these women for more than a decade. No one ever watched those films coming out more devout or ritual oriented, or I need to like dresses. In fact, someone I remember, and I actually wrote this somewhere recently, that I think they loved the ritual scenes for the outfits that the girls were wearing in them. Like, I remember someone said, "Oh, I want a sari like the one in the puja scene," right? Like, as an example. But that's the working class, emerging middle class, like those stories. Now, when I look at the elites, the sense I actually have is that a lot of the idioms that were being shown actually represented their life. When we actually talk about the fight around employment and gender, Tejaswini, and I think you know this as well as I do, the real churn is happening not in our class. It's happening in these other groups, right? Which I just discussed, like be it in, Bapu Nagar or in Rampur. The latest data tells us that only 6.5% of married women in India's richest 20% hold a job. This is CMIE data. And there are far more women wanting to stand economically independent, fighting with in-laws, all of that. That's happening in the emerging middle classes, the precariat. And so the fact that Shah Rukh's films of a certain vintage were showing these very ritualistic norms, in a way, it was only representing what I think a lot of these women were seeing in their real life. So it wasn't really like it wasn't a disjunction. It was in fact almost representation. But I didn't hear anyone complain about the representation. What I did hear everyone say is that, have you seen in those films, he's always helping in the housework? Because even in that very traditional patriarchal family setup that those films, at least a certain part of his romantic films, showed in the beginning, I think he deviated from that very much so, but in the early parts of his filmography, men were doing things that men usually aren't seen doing in that setup. He was cutting vegetables, helping pick people's saris, doing all kinds of things that you just don't see around domestic labor, emotional labor, the labor. And all said and done, ritual is labor. I mean, we know this, right? Like, participating in ritual is actually one of the flexible forms of labor that women are involved in. And to see a man doing that was a real break. So I think that's where I found the commentary on family life coming in amongst the elite. But moving away from the elite, everyone just saw it as flights of fancy, where none of this was real, but wanting to find a man like that was real.
I think this brings us to a very nice conclusion to this discussion. When you speak about Shah Rukh Khan helping out in the household and
Yes.
taking up what's considered normally like a feminist task, or sorry, a feminine task. Yeah.
Yes.
So the question is, you say that Shah Rukh Khan is clearly not a feminist icon, but he's a female icon.
Yeah.
So is your comment related to his on-screen persona or his off-screen one? So is it an analytical comment you're giving us, or is it how his fans really perceive him?
I think it's an analytical comment based on things I've heard from fans. So I'll tell you where it comes from. It comes from the fact that particularly English speaking fans of his, and this is true, by the way, I mean, even now there are fans of his on this, on this webinar of ours, it'll come up. They'll always say to me, I feel very uncomfortable about the films where he's stalking women, the ritual that we discussed in the films. There is this need, I think, amongst these women to distance themselves from that script in his filmography, particularly where there's violent harm or psychological harm being told on women. And we have to acknowledge that that's a very important part. I mean, I actually say, he's South Asia's romantic superhero, but prior to that, he was, our lonely supervillain. He played these characters, which is a very important part of his filmography in the early part. And I think the reason why I noticed then many of the women would say to me, these English speaking fans who come from an education that they understand feminist ideas, they have some access to that language, they would say to me, well, he's not a feminist icon. And I kept hearing that, and I realized that even for me, this is true. I mean, those are parts of his filmography. There are bits in it that I enjoy, like some of the songs and all of that. But there's a whole, dialogue there about like the modern day incel movement, honestly. I mean, he is the first South Asian incel in those films. That I did want to create some distance from. But then having created that distance, I didn't want to do this binary making of, well, okay, if he's done toxic things, then the full iconography is sort of unfeminist or not supportive of women, because that's not true as well. I mean, listening to the things I was listening to, that these women were picking and choosing. So they would ignore a dar, but they would glorify a DDLJ, right? And even parts of a DDLJ. And so I think the reason I made that analytical comment based on, I think, what I was hearing, and this is, by the way, true for certainly his on-screen persona, because his off-screen persona, it's the interviews, and the interviews have been nothing but, in fact, he was talking about women's toilets even before feminism was trendy, right? Like there's been a resurgence of a certain kind of language in popular culture and the kinds of ways, celebrities talk. He was talking about building women's toilets and about his mother being a single woman way before all of this. And, he actually went on Simi Grewal and he said things like, there's a lot of woman in me, which is a really remarkable thing actually for a mainstream hero to say, if you think about it. And so I think the feminist icon, but a female one, is an amalgamation of an acknowledgement, an honest acknowledgement from my part, and also the women I spoke to, that there are parts of his on-screen persona and films that one should be very critical of, and it's okay to be critical of, and yet it's also okay to be critical of them and enjoy and endorse other parts of his icon as well. So hence, he's not a feminist icon, but a woman's icon, a female one.
I think that we can't hold back your audience any longer.
No.
There are chat boxes bursting with questions.
Okay.
So we'll move to that. Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. And I look forward to renewing the conversation very soon when you come to Ahmedabad.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tejaswini.
So let me try and pull out some questions that maybe group them or something. Yeah?
Please.
Tejaswini, you can go ahead and do that, or I can do it for you.
Okay, why don't you?
Okay, all right. Because I've already been doing that and listening to this very engaging 1-hour conversation. So first up, we have Professor Sonal Yadav. She's a professor in the economics and public policy area in Ahmedabad University.
Hi.
So Sonal, would you like to come on camera, unmute yourself, and ask your question?
Yes. Thank you so much, Momita, and thank you, Tejaswini and Sharanya, for that very engaging conversation. So I have this question that what is the methodology of data collection? Like, how did you select your sample? And another question is, was there any attrition rate? Like, you started, interviewing a woman, and then in between she denies to, respond and drops that, no, I don't want to now further interview. So was that happening with you?
Yes, it happened a lot with me. Let me start by saying that. Okay, so firstly, one thing I do want to sort of be very clear about here is that many of the women I started interviewing, this is not some statistical sample that I created. This is life. I lived life and I met women. And wherever, if you know me, you'll know that I love talking about Shah Rukh. And this started in 2006, in fact, in Ahmedabad. I was doing research on home-based agarbatti makers and garment workers. This was with Seva.
Right.
And essentially, we were supposed to collect data on wages and working conditions. And when I showed up, I was in my early 20s, very young. I was an RA. And when I showed up, I asked all these women these questions, and they just looked thoroughly bored because they had done this survey for themselves before, because they were active, I think, there was a big agitation around incense workers' rights and, their wage rates and so on and so forth, led by Seva and this group. And so what ended up happening was they said, well, we'll answer the questions, but, we've answered these questions before. And what I decided to do at that point then was essentially take a break. And we started talking about the few things that we had in common, and Shah Rukh emerged because I would ask everyone as an icebreaker, who's your favorite actor? And so then I met Shah Rukh fans. So what I did was, so there's a woman who is an agarbatti worker, a garment maker, and her daughter, who are a principal set of characters in the book, who I followed for a long period of time. From there, I went to the villages of Uttar Pradesh with a similar project in an area called Rampur, who are home-based embroidery makers. And so there's a young woman there, a young Muslim woman who I've also had the privilege to follow. After that, I went to Jharkhand for another project, which was on migrant domestic workers. And I used the same icebreaker technique, and I found all these fans. But there I didn't find so many fans, but I found migrant women who were fans. So there's a woman who is a migrant domestic worker, moved from Jharkhand to Delhi, who I follow. And then in my own work, actually, I was working at the Delhi Secretariat briefly, and there was a young woman who was a state government accountant who I follow in the book. She's a junior service cadre officer. And then there are others who then I specifically recruited. So the elite segments of the book, the upper class segments of the book, have around composites of around 85 people. And I follow one person in particular called Vidya, who's an IIT IIM graduate, who I actually just happened to meet in a cinema hall. And there's my own story there as well. And the emerging middle class is one I mentioned, the accountant, and another young woman called Gold, who I met at a nightclub. So I'm not, this is not, I'm enough of an economist to know that this is not at all a representative sample in any sense of the term. And I don't claim for it to be. But what I actually realize, and hopefully when you read this, ma'am, you'll see, which is that the themes that they're talking about the economy, about employment, about issues, they immediately echo with broader literature and broader trends. So the book actually combines the data along with economic theory on why is it that women are struggling to find money and to hold on to their own jobs, or why is it that they're feeling lonely. There's a lot of actually literature there as well. And it tries to just bring the qualitative, which is, somewhat, completely selected based on whoever was willing to talk to me. And you're right, there were other women I wanted to follow, but they just couldn't, I couldn't follow up. Many people don't have mobile phones. People don't have email addresses. Many people also just move around. People get married, you lose touch. And I try and be as transparent as I can about the book, about this in the book. And many people also, even after I'd written the chapter, had to sort of junk the chapter because their in-laws didn't give permission, for example, for their stories to be written. And so that happens as well. So it's a set of, I was living life and I met all these women and some of them indulged me, and that's how I wrote their stories. But then in the stories, there are arcs that then draw on contemporary data, which is there. There's an entire segment on, the book is quite evidence-based, but there I use CMIE, NSS, PLFS, all of that. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you. The title of the book is very catchy. I'll read it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree, Sonal. So we have next question from Chor Shanbe. I hope I am pronouncing the name right. So go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for this presentation, but I was a bit late and I wish I could join earlier because of this internet connection. I just, I mean, my question is come at end, but I just made one comment. This is very interesting because I had the same interest on studying how these Bollywood movies actually impact the life of people in Tajikistan. Let me introduce myself. I'm Chorshanbek Nazarov from Tajikistan. I work for the University of Central Asia as a research fellow at the Cultural Heritage Humanities Unit. And this was kind of my interest in a long time during the Soviet Union time.
Yeah.
We had the huge kind of, queue to have these Bollywood movies. So one of these interesting things was that this loyalty and the notion of love, actually the Indian love, was so strong, and then people used to the photos of these Bollywood actors to present during various kind of occasions, and write like on this postcard that I wish have this kind of lover or husband or whatever it is. And then again during the wedding, people used to make a speech, and what they wish, that they say, we wish you an Indian love. And Indian love through these Bollywood movies, kind of a representation of strong love, a love that lasts for longer. So my question is, maybe you have written your book, but I haven't read your book, but I'm looking forward to read it. And also maybe you have given to during your presentation, but my question is, why Shah Rukh Khan? Because there's so many actors like people are fond of, like Amir Khan, Salman Khan, like Amitabh Bachchan and all, Mithun Chakraborty during those old times. But why Shah Rukh Khan? What was
okay? That's so great.
Thank you.
No, thank you. That's so. Firstly, I want to actually just start by telling you, there's I use Google Trend data to see where Shah Rukh is being most searched, and Tajikistan is one of the countries that pops up as sort of a one of those areas. But I want to just say a couple of things. You're right. There are lots of actors who are very popular. The reason why this was Shah Rukh is, I have to just be transparent, I'm a massive fan. And whenever I would ask women, and this became a topic of mutual exchange. And, in a country where often we don't actually have language to talk about love, intimacy, sex, desire in a very open way, suddenly I realized, and you will discover this hopefully when you read the book, suddenly I realized that when I was talking about him with all these women who loved him as much as I did, we were no longer talking about him. We were actually talking about all these other things that he triggered, right? And it's almost as if he holds all these symbols together, right? So that's important. The second thing, I want to sort of say this, which is really important, is that he is very different from the other Khans. I get into this in the book because, I often say that Shah Rukh Khan in this book is my research method. And so there's an entire chapter which is called Who is Shah Rukh? Because I felt like a good social scientist, I should explain my research method. What is it that so many women and scholars see when they see his image? And he has been analyzed a lot from the sort of traditional film studies lens. And one of the things that's really important, and I actually interviewed a bunch of film scholars and critics who also taught me this, which is that, while Amir has this sort of masculinity of productive professionalism, right? Like he picks great scripts and there are these great roles. Salman's masculinity is very much one about the stoic, reserved guy who like beat you up. Shah Rukh's the only one whose masculinity is extremely tender when it comes to women. He will constantly shed tears. The characters are very aware of the other's gaze. They are constantly engaging with others, particularly women. There's more dialogue time for women in his films. So it's not surprising to me in a country where actually women are onerously dealing with all the emotional labor, domestic labor, that in their fantasy life, they like this actor who performs these roles. Amir Khan and Salman Khan do not perform these roles. Amitabh Bachchan never performed that role. And I think he's a very big shift when it comes to masculinity in India. And hopefully we'll talk about this more after you've read the book, but you'll get a sense of it. So there's a reason, I think there's a practical reason why is because I asked the question and then because of conversation, this just happened. But then as I started to follow the story and I spoke to film critics and scholars, I also, and especially when I measured dialogue time in his films and compared to say an Amir film or other films, I actually realized that there was something very charged about the masculinity that he presented. It's a big deviation from traditional masculinity. And the last thing I will say on this is he's also our first post-liberalization superstar. So, India in the 1990s went through these big economic reforms. And suddenly there was telecom, satellite TV opened up everywhere. He was very much the first star who capitalized on those reforms and sort of, came on screen. And so he's actually almost a bearer of India's market reform story, the media proliferating, and also a very different kind of masculinity. So that's why Shah Rukh. And he's just the sexier one. I mean, that's a different story. But
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I absolutely agree with the last statement. Thank you for your question. So next up, we have Ritik. So Ritik, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Ma'am, whenever we are talking about women, most of the time our debate ends at a point that they should be financially independent or marry, that is marriage. So this reductionism is how much proper, appropriate. And the second thing is what we call well-to-do families in our normal middle-class societies. They have they are financially strong, but what share women get is very much important.
yeah,
They they get the opportunity of malls, markets, and in housework they get maids as well. But after all, they end up not doing anything to their potential, any sort of art or any sort of economic activity or something out of their house, participate in society,
yeah.
participate in any public work. So how there these spaces can be created for women so that they can lead a life to their potential and come out of the clutches of men controlling. So that's what.
Thank you, Ritik. That's a great question. I actually have a very, given time as a constraint, I have a very concise answer to that. I actually think the biggest revolution that can happen in India is if men start to help out in housework, not as some magnanimous show of how progressive they are, but they start to learn that this is almost a natural part of what they're supposed to be as people. India is right now in the bottom 5 when it comes to men helping in housework. The reason why, in fact, even in what you call these well-to-do communities, many women, and in fact, I followed them during the 4 or 5 years I knew them, many of them dropped out of the workforce after marriage or motherhood. And and there's a lot of data on this, Ritik, it's there in the book. There's a lot of people who've studied lots of, and they've studied it well. And they essentially say that marriage and motherhood is typically what tends to kick women out of the paid workforce. No matter how hard you may want to try, you may have aspirations, but it's just very difficult. And even, by the way, with maids and house help and carers, it can be difficult because women are still responsible. And that brings me to the other side, which is one big revolution is men, assuming greater roles within the home and being comfortable doing so, which I just don't see big mass scale changes on that yet. And the second is actually companies and the jobs landscape for women. There's a lot of work. One of the key reasons why we see women are dropping out of the workforce or not finding jobs is because the kinds of jobs that they are skilled to do and able to do, which also allow for flexibility, just don't exist. So there's also a problem with the supply side, right, of jobs, and that's a more industrial policy, employment policy question. So I think those two need to shift if we're going to see traction on this. And as for the women going to malls and all of that, one thing I really want all of us to know, and when you read the book, you'll have a sense of, is that I think a lot of the women we think are having very lovely, easy lives. There's a lot of violence and a lot of everyday labor in those lives. You just don't see it. For perhaps what it is. So, I mean, more power to those who go to malls and want to do what they want to do. But I do think that the big shifts, I think the big revolutionary shifts to me are if we actually start to have very serious conversations around affirmative action for women in jobs, create the supply pipeline for jobs. Those just don't exist right now. And on the other hand, if men start actually helping in the domain of care work, in a much more serious way, as opposed to just sort of treating it as some kind of one ad hoc thing. But thank you.
Thank you, Ritik, for your question. Next up, we have Pallavi Vyas. So she's also a professor at the economics and social science, public policy area. So Pallavi, could you please ask your question?
sure. Thanks so much, Shayana. I haven't read the book, so can't hear me.
Pallavi, you're not audible.
That. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
So thanks a lot. This is, of course, I'm going to get the book immediately. So my question is that, see, in my view, I don't think Shah Rukh's roles are that kind of non-patriarchal in his movies. Like, he's the strong man, the hero, saving damsels in distress. Yeah, he might chop a few onions and he may not eat, till the girl eats before that. What is that? There's that.
Garba Chauth.
So he may not eat before that. I mean, that's all. That's cool. And actually, really admire the writers. It was the writers. I mean, it was all they're doing. These, awesome, strong women that wrote that script. But in general, he's the strong man. He's not, at least from my perspective, like, maybe it depends on where you're at in your surrounding of patriarchy, where you think that he is breaking the patriarchal norm in some sense. But it depends on where you're at on the patriarchal system in your own personal life, where you actually think he's breaking something or not, is what I'm realizing after you've been talking, even after I wrote
that. It's very layered. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, my point is that, okay, so one is that you were saying that, women tend to aspire for something like the property and, like, making it from nothing to something, like the way
some of them
made it. Yeah. So, I mean, when I look at role models, for me, oftentimes they're women. And even for a lot of women, when you're looking at some woman that made it, because a woman has to go through much, a different set of circumstances. So why do you not think of infusing a woman role model in your conversation?
So they're there, Pallavi. But I also have to be very honest about the cultural landscape we live in. We live in a culture where, and in fact, it comes up in the beginning, which is, someone says to me, have you noticed that no one ever talks about Aishwarya Rai the way they talk about him? She's as self-made as he was, right? They both come from no family and all of that. And it is because we do live in a culture where men's successes are more charged than women. And you start to see a generational shift. So, for example, there's a young woman in the book whose mother is a agarbatti maker, who I was talking about earlier. She loves Priyanka Chopra. She wants to be her. She sees all these things. But the one thing I will say about this, and I'll come to that in a second. So they're there. I will disagree with you about Shah Rukh being the strong man, though, and I think there's enough writing about him that also disagrees with what you're saying. And so I'll actually, I think there's actually evidence in theory that bears this out. Which man do you know would do Chak De, for instance? He's not a strong man in Chak De. He's not a strong man in Swades. You only have to, I don't know whether if you watch even Zero, which was his last film, he plays a man who's a dwarf, who then the women in the film are telling him, you don't measure up to us, quite literally and metaphorically. I don't know of another big movie star in the sort of Indian landscape in popular Hindi cinema of that wattage who would take on those roles. So I think we should acknowledge very clearly that I do think he takes on roles that are quite different from the traditional masculine portrait in cinema. And data proves it, because the women are just speaking much more in his films. You compare a Zero, say, to a film like Dangal, which seems like it's about women. But if you watch Dangal and measure Dangal, the narrator is a man. The principal character very much, they make the story about two women about the man. You take a film like Pink, right? All these so-called feminist women's films, the men are speaking. Amitabh Bachchan speaks much more in Pink than any of the women combined. So I think there is and people are not foolish. People are not blind to that. I think people see it, that there is a difference in the way the female characters and male characters genuinely engage. You can call them soppy, regressive, all of that is fine, but there's a genuine engagement with women's aspirations, be it on the sports field, be it, a teacher in a village, there's so many examples of that. So that's one. And the second, I think you can't call him honestly a strongman also, because if you look at interviews, which by the way is a significant chunk of his persona, and this is where liberalization comes into play. We are not thinking of him just as like the films he's done. I think he is very much also the guy who shows up in interviews and talks about there being a lot of women in him. Now, we can say that's posturing. We can say the way he talks about women, and he's been talking about women, as I said, way before it was trendy to do so. We can look at all of that and say it's posturing, but as one young woman in the book said to me, and in fact several said to me, they said, but who else is posturing like that in our culture? Especially given now who are our icons in our public culture. It's all this like Chabbis Chhati and all of this is happening, right? Having said that, though, icons are always evolving. His next film, I actually do expect that he will play like a very macho role. He's doing Pathan. But I would also contend, and there are people who watch his films very closely and say this, which is that even in films where he's playing dons, robbers, all of that, there's a physical softness, and there's a softness particularly when it comes to engaging with women, which you don't see in a Salman film. You will never see in an Amitabh film. You will never see it in an Akshay Kumar film. There are like big tropes, right? So I do think we should acknowledge that for what it is. I think to call him a strong man relative to the kinds of strong men in our popular culture, I think I don't know how much data itself will not bear it out, right? Like if I look at these films as data and his interviews as data. I think the last thing I will want to say is I really think we should retire this idea that because women are gushing about an actor, that the actor has become some, larger than life sort of creature. In fact, one of the things that I'm trying very hard through the book to push is, and I think some people get it, is that actually everyone is co-creating him. He is not some, one sort of, this idea of one man that has then been consumed exactly by the same way by the same types of people. And given we live in a world, and I think why is it that these women are seeking Shah Rukh and not seeking Indra Nui or anyone else? Well, because most women don't know Indra Nui in the book. They won't even know phrases like feminism, all the sort of, I think the things that are very natural in conversation between all of us. These women don't know them. And I think in a world, in a landscape where popular culture still has a very strong imprint psychologically on the languages, on people, on what they're seeing, what they're consuming, the affective role it has, it's not surprising to me that they are saying him. But I see a huge generational shift. I write about this towards the second part of the book as I start to reach the conclusion, particularly post 2015-16. Where one of the things you actually start to immediately see is that all these young girls, they aspire to be a Deepika, or they will talk about Shah Rukh much more from the perspective of his economic success, as opposed to wanting to none of them want to marry a benevolent patriarch. They just want to be left on their own, and they want to do as well as he does. So you see these shifts, but those are intergenerational shifts. They take a very long period of time. And I want to also say one thing about women icons. I think, in fact, the women in my book are their own icons. And that's actually the way I wrote them. And what I mean by that is that I'm tired of this CEO feminism. Like if I hear another person telling me like, oh, look at a CEO and she's made it. And like, I'm tired of that, because the amount of privilege that you have to enter with to reach those stages, it's very difficult. And so I think that all of these women are looking at actually icons, not just Shah Rukh, but in their own life. When you read the book, you'll realize these women rely on each other, their friends, themselves. And I actually say that I don't think they idolize him, they idolize their own independence. And they are their own icons. And I wrote them because I call it dal sabzi feminism. I'm not interested in a feminism that is just about achievement or outer display. I think all of these women, they may not know the language of feminism, but they are practicing very complex negotiations every day to just do something as simple as want to like earn some money to want to watch an actor you like. And I think, in fact, in seeking Shah Rukh, I don't think that they're celebrating him as a celebrity. I think they're celebrating their own pleasure, because what they're saying is, I enjoy watching this man. Someone may enjoy watching Salman. I mean, I'm sure someone's welcome to write that if they'd like. Someone may enjoy watching Priyanka. But in seeking him, they are seeking their own pleasure. And so I think, to me, in fact, in the book, I didn't write it with any idea of saying Shah Rukh is their icon. I keep saying this, and you'll see it, he is a research tool that allows for them to talk about themselves, their lives. He holds more power in that than any woman right now in sort of the corporate world or in our politics certainly would. I think that will change. I suspect now if I go and start talking to girls about Deepika Padukone, I'll learn a lot. I mean, I think she can be like the next research tool, right? That'll happen. And so I do see those shifts, but I do think we need to sort of recognize that these are all women who are their own icons, their own independence. That's their icon.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you, Pallavi. And if I may add to that, maybe because I'm also a big Shah Rukh Khan fan, but if we, and I don't know whether there's research on this, but if we compare posters of Shah Rukh Khan movies versus other movies, say Pink and Dear Zindagi or something, I have usually found that Shah Rukh Khan usually occupies as much space as the female co-stars. But if you see a poster of Pink, maybe 75% of the poster is the male actor, and then you have the other female actors there. So I don't know if there's research on this, but I also feel that when it comes to Shah Rukh Khan, he does share the poster space also with his female co-actors. So anyway, let's have the next question. So we have Professor Jinal Parekh. So Jinal, if you could ask your question.
Yeah. Thank you, Shrayana, in the first place
Hi.
for this. Hi. Thank you for this interesting conversation. Though I have not read the book, what I remember of Shah Rukh is, this signature pose, two arms, up in the air, like sort of calling. I mean, like all other kids would have watched those movies. I also have been watching his movies and grown up watching his movies. So that is what I remember. But I was kind of wondering whether Shah Rukh Khan himself has read your book. And then if at all he has, then what is his take on your book?
His team has it, and I'll know soon enough.
Okay.
That's as I know. His team has it, and we will know soon. But I think the arms wide open. It's funny. It keeps coming up actually in conversation, which is people keep talking about the way he touches women, and because there's a lot of like this kind of imagery, right? Which people, and then you see in the book they start to talk about their own sex lives, commenting on how is it that men can't touch the same way. So yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. But yes, he knows. I mean, his team is very well aware of the book. It's with them, and inshallah we will. That's the review I'm waiting for.
All right. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jinal. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for all your questions. Oops, we probably have one last question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So this is from Professor Amol Agarwal. So his question is, sorry, just give me 1 second. So I'll just ask out the whole thing. So what you have done, so he comments here, so that compliments you. So what you have done is to bring this big problem of lack of opportunities for women from most, if not all aspects of economic life. And you have interestingly brought SRK into the conversation. This has led many people to read the book and hopefully be aware of the issues. Now you're an economist too, and you could have written a very economics kind of text, but I doubt whether there would be similar excitement for the book. So how do you see these two kind of books? Do you think economists should explore writing books?
Yes.
For the common audience?
Yes. I think that we do a huge disservice by thinking that. First, I want to just start by thanking Professor Abhijit Banerjee and Professor Devki Jain, the two economists who blurbed my book and engaged with it deeply. I was very scared when I sent it to them, as you can imagine, because they're very serious economists. But I'm very pleased that they did. And I think one of the things I've learned looking at the reaction to the book is, often we tend to think economics is data. So if you have a book with lots of data, that's apparently an economics book, but that's not true. All economists know economics is actually theory, it's concepts, it's explaining trade-offs, it's explaining bargains. And I think, in fact, in the book, one thing I do use is a lot of economic theory. I mean, data is right there, but I want to use theory to explain to a person who may be afraid of economics, honestly, or may think the subject is really dry, to actually make, for example, intra-household bargaining theory come alive for them, right? Like, which is such an important seminal piece of work in development economics when we think about gender. So I'm a big believer that economists should stop. I mean, I think there's a kind of economics that's written for other economists. I can't write that kind of economics. I don't have a PhD in economics. I don't aspire to be an academic. So I decided to go a very different route. I decided to write a book which does use economics and is describing the economy, but I wanted to do it in a much more accessible way. And I wanted just non-economists to be able to engage with it as well. And that was very important to me. So yes, I'm a big believer of that, because the one thing I think that's really important is you can only tell these stories effectively if you actually understand that theory and data really well. If you don't know that, then you're going to end up, the stories will be selected in odd ways. And I think it's important for economists to sort of, enter much more public conversation. Some of my favorite writing by economists does that. And I think more of us should be doing that.
I agree. Thank you, Shana. So I think we had a lot of questions. So now I'm going to hand it over to Tejaswini and ask her to share her concluding comments.
That's a really tough one. This has been an amazing discussion, and audience questions as well have ranged across any topic that might be of interest in the contemporary world. And it's really taking off from the question of cinema, popular culture, fandom, pleasure, desire, sexuality, women's access to employment, and the kind of opportunities that are available to women today, the use of data, the use of treating data with narrative. I mean, there's so many aspects of how to strategize around presenting complex ideas to a more general audience. Public engagement that Shayana is so good at, and I think is so important for many of us who have PhDs and who are trying to write our work in a way that other people outside of our own small groups would be able to appreciate and read. I think there is so much that all of us have learned from this conversation. Some of us have read the book and loved it. I encourage the rest of you also to get your hands on a copy as well. I think there are too many comments still coming up in the chat box. I think if they are from Ahmedabad, people just wait. She's coming soon. So we really look forward to hosting you here, Shrayana, and we promise you a good time. I hope you're staying long enough.
I certainly will. I certainly will. Thank you so much, Tejaswini, Momita, everyone who asked questions, Ravi as well, for having me here. I am really excited to be back in Ahmedabad, given that the book started in Ahmedabad. The first set of people the fans I accidentally bumped into were in Ahmedabad. So for me, it's a real pleasure, and I cannot wait to be back. I will spend enough time. And there will be a book signing. I'm promising that already. And I look forward to meeting all of you there. Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raina. Thank you, Tejaswini, for that engaging conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll see you in the next session of the conversation series. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.